Cleveland, as a city, it was named after a lawyer named Moses Cleveland, who landed in a dinghy at the mouth of the Cuyahoga on July 22nd, 1796. So before we even get to that event, the day before, July 21st, 1796, if someone was to have come to this area right here, could you paint a picture with words of what they would have seen in Ohio City?
Well, in Ohio City, and both Ohio City and Cleveland, it would make no difference. I mean, this whole area was wilderness. In fact, there's a folktale that states that there were so many trees in the area that a squirrel could go from Lake Erie and hop from tree to tree to tree to the Ohio River on the south and never come down. That's how many trees there were. Anyway, that's the folktale.
And when Moses did come, why was there uneven development on each side? I mean, like, what was he here to do?
Oh, my God. Well, there's a lot more background. It's hard to just throw Moses into this without giving a little background. He was a representative of the Connecticut Land Company. Okay, the Connecticut Land Company. The state of Connecticut, before it was a state, was a colony. And our history, believe it or not, goes back to 1662, when the colony of Connecticut went to Charles II of England and asked for a land grant. That was not unusual for the colonies to do this. Connecticut gets a land grant, and using its northern and southern boundary, they extended on a charter the colony of Connecticut to the Old South Sea. We call it the Pacific Ocean. And so Connecticut goes across the country in a band, and never mind the king didn't control part of it that France had in Spain. That wasn't his problem. He didn't care. But eventually, okay, let's fast forward to our Revolutionary War. During the war in Connecticut, many of the towns and villages were being attacked. There were great fires. The survivors of the fires were told, if we should win this war, of course we did, we will give you land in our new Connecticut. We have all this land to the west of us. So after the war, in fact, 3 years after the war, in 1786, Connecticut cedes a lot of its land claims. Most of the states at that time did, so they could create other states from it. But Connecticut says, we're a small state. We want to save part of our area. And also, we've reserved it. We've actually promised it to the sufferers of these fires. And so we're going to reserve part of our western claim. Therefore, we are the western reserve of the state of Connecticut. Now, oh, I love that. In 1792, Connecticut then sets aside, they were very, very foxy, I think. They were setting aside just a portion, 500,000 acres to the farthest west end of the Western Reserve. And how big is the Western Reserve? It runs from the Pennsylvania border 120 miles west to about Sandusky. Lake Erie is the northern boundary, and the 41st parallel would be the southern boundary. It's like the upper fifth of the state of Ohio in the northeast corner. So now I lost my train of thought.
Where you were going with the firelands?
Yes, firelands, yes. All right, so thank you. Just so that the western extreme of it was set aside as the firelands, 500,000 acres. But the rest of it was for sale. They were all into speculation. We're going to sell the Western Reserve, make lots of money. And of course, the Connecticut state sells it to 49 Connecticut investors. And one of them happened to be Moses Cleveland. We're making the connections now. So now, good old Moses Cleveland was a lawyer. He was not a surveyor. He was one of the investors. The Connecticut Land Company is formed in 1795, and that's when they buy, in fact, they buy the Western Reserve, the part that they could buy outside of the firelands. They bought it for a little over $1 million. That's like 40 cents an acre. But before they could begin selling the land, they had to map out the land so they could actually know what piece of land you're getting. And so they sent out a surveying party in 1796, headed by good old Moses Cleveland. Comes out to the eastern end of what is now the state of Ohio, which becomes a state, by the way, in 1803, so it wasn't quite a state yet. And they begin doing their mapping, going from the Pennsylvania border, working their way west. One of the charges that Moses Cleveland was asked to do was to find the so-called capital of this Western Reserve. So he lets the rest of the guys do their surveying along the border, and they're working their way slowly east. And by the way, it was very slow, because it was full of rocks and hills and trees and mosquitoes. It was not easy. He gets on his dinghy, leaves all these people behind, gets on his dinghy, comes down Lake Erie, and comes to the mouth of the Cuyahoga River. And on July 22nd, 1796, as has been said, he comes up on the east bank and founds the future city of Cleveland. He and a few surveyors lay out Cleveland on a New England town plan around a common or a green. We call it Public Square. He lays out the streets after the Great Lakes, Superior, Ontario, East Nyack, Euclid. He spends a whole 4 months in downtown Cleveland, gets back in his dinghy when October rolls around because the weather's changing, goes back to Connecticut, never comes back again. So much for the founder of the city of Cleveland. But the problem is he didn't finish the map, so the Connecticut Land Company was not too pleased with Moses that year. The next year, they sent out a second surveying party. This one is headed by a religious figure, Seth Hart, who happens to be an Episcopalian minister, and the chief surveyor was Seth Pease. They finally finished the map, and now we can start selling off the Western Reserve, at least the eastern half, by the way. Let me make that clear. All he had to do is the Cuyahoga River to the Pennsylvania border. The other half had still Indian claims. The west side, where we are now, was still Indian claims. That's why Cleveland is going to start, has a head start on us, because they're going to be settled way before us, or slightly before us. Anyway, so people were not beating down the trees to get out here. Eventually, there are more settlers and more settlers coming to the east side of the Cuyahoga River. In 1814, Cleveland becomes a village. That's shortly after the Second War we had with Britain, by the way, the War of 1812, and it concludes 1813 with the Battle of Lake Erie, and the very next year, Cleveland becomes a village. Now, this is what really puts us on the map. Very next thing that happens, the state of Ohio decides we're not doing well up, and Cincinnati was doing much better than us, and the Ohio River was really helping them a lot. And you would think the lake would have helped us, but it really wasn't at the time. But in the 1820s, it was a national phenomena to do canal systems, and New York was finishing the Erie Canal.
We'll get to that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up. You got to throw something and stop me.
So, and I should have said this before, just so you know, for the majority of the audience, we were going to have some slides up here, so you can actually see what was happening at the time. There's going to be maps and some illustrations. So,
Can we hold that for a minute? That is the early map of Cleveland when it was a village. And notice that everything's at right angles. All the streets are around Public Square, and they're all diagonal at right angles around Public Square. Notice there are no diagonals. Euclid Avenue's not there. Prospect, Huron, they come a little later in the early 19th century. But when Moses Cleveland laid out the town, there's your New England town plan. And notice the west side. Nothing. The few little dots you see there are a few little cabins here and there. But outside of that, not much was happening.
And Tim, in the upper left corner of this map, there's a little lake
yes.
there. And, could you explain why the lake was there?
Well, it's actually not the lake. It's actually the last bend in the Cuyahoga River. The river is a very old river. That's why we have that lowlands, the flats area. It's so wide. It's because it's an old river, and because it's old, it meanders. It goes all over the place. And when it got up near the lake, and the lake, of course, was moving as well, getting larger at points, and so the last bend of the Cuyahoga River got very close to the lake, and then it pulls back again, and then it goes off, and the real original mouth of the Cuyahoga was really around West 58th Street, along the shoreway there. That little slip that you see enclosed by that would be Whiskey Island today. So that was really the last bend. In 1827, though, the feds gave enough money to cut a new mouth in the Cuyahoga River. And so that's the mouth that we have today. And what it did, it threw this Whiskey Island originally was part of Cleveland.
You mean the east side of Cleveland? The
east side of Cleveland, right. The east side, yes. The east side of Cleveland until that new channel was cut in 1827. And once that happened, that whole area of Whiskey Island was thrown onto the west side.
And Tim, we were going to get to this later, but the legend that I heard when I first came here was that Whiskey Island was named because people in Prohibition were importing Canadian whiskey across the lake, and that was the best landing point for it. Is that true?
Wow. There's a lot of stories and folk tales that go into all these things, and I don't know if that one's true. It may well be true. The one I know is that there's actually a depiction of the mouth of the Cuyahoga River showing the east side on one side and the west side on the other side very early on. And on the west side, they're looking south, right down the mouth of the river. And on the west side, you see this plateau on Whiskey Island. Well, the idea was, it's not there today, but originally they thought that plateau was not a natural formation, it was an Indian mound. Now that land was actually owned, again it was part of Cleveland's on the east side early on, and one of the first settlers was Lorenzo Carter. Carter buys a large piece of land, including that, and Lorenzo Carter was into all kinds of things, including the making of whiskey. And it is said that he built a still on top of the mound on Whiskey Island. And that's the story I know.
Okay, so it's much earlier than the...
Well, I think it's earlier, but again, that may be a folktale too.
Okay. So for people that don't know Tim, he's also passionate about churches and their place in Cleveland's history. And we noted on the Facebook invitation, if you did see it, that the east side and the west side division might have been because of religion. So Tim, Could you, walking through the establishment of the Village of Cleveland and then the future establishment of the west side of Cleveland, could you tell us a little bit about the founding of the first church in Cleveland?
Okay, Cleveland, of course, becomes a village, as I said, in 1814, but the first religious action in what is now Greater Cleveland doesn't happen in the village of Cleveland. It happens on the west side. And by the way, the west side at this time was still part of the Western Reserve. It didn't really have any identification outside of being part of the Western Reserve. But the very first, one of those cabins that I was pointing out in the west side that was kind of dotted around, one of them happened to be a cabin of Phineas Shepherd. It was a tavern at the corner of what is today West 25th Street in Lorraine, or West 25th Street in Detroit. And on November 9th, 1816, a group of Episcopalian interested congregants got together and decided they were going to form an Episcopal church. The very next year, crossing back, this is where the first clues of the rivalry between the east side and the west side, believe it or not, start with the founding of the first church. Okay, first we have Phineas Shepherd, 1816. The very next year, the people on the east side decide, okay, we're going to take that idea. It's still going to be an Episcopal church. We're going to found, 1817, Trinity Cleveland. The next year, back on the west side, those folks over there said, oh, that's nice, and we're Episcopalian over here, so we will also start a church. 1818 becomes Trinity Brooklyn. So at one time, we had Trinity Cleveland and Trinity Brooklyn simultaneously on either side of the rivers, basically the same congregation, and that existed until 1820. Now, do you want me to do the 1818 township thing at this point?
That would be fantastic.
Okay, 1818, when the west side develops Trinity Brooklyn, that name is important. In 1818, one of the investors, the Connecticut Land Company, there were 4 draws when they divided up the land amongst the investors.
Could you explain the draws system there?
Okay, the draw system was the investors, there were 49 investors in the Connecticut Land Company, and they all put in certain amounts in their investment, and depending on how much they put in, that's how much they got out. And it was really like pulling paper from a hat. They had 4 draws, and they had the whole area once it was mapped, and they had to find certain parcels within the area, and depending on how much you put in, you would pull those parcels out of the hat. It wasn't a great idea necessarily, because you might have one parcel here and then miles away another one, but anyway, that's how they did it. The very last draw, so to speak, the last draft, happens after there's an Indian treaty signed on to free up the west side of the Western Reserve. That happens in 1805. And in 1807, the map then is done for the west part of the Western Reserve. And by the way, a footnote. In 1809, the state of Ohio is around now, and they saw, that the survivors of the fires of the Revolutionary War and that area in the far end of the Western Reserve, well, they decided to build the first state road on the west side. It will be run along a lake on the west side, and it'll be called the Huron Roads Turnpike. It'll run from the valley and the Cuyahoga River out to Huron. Huron is where the survivors of those fires were given land. If you go out to Huron today, Huron and Erie counties today, it's out near Sandusky. You drive around there, you'll see Firelands gas station, Firelands College, Firelands Hospital. There were no fires out there. The fires they're talking about are the fires of the Revolutionary War. This was the land given to the Connecticut folk for suffering the fires of the Revolutionary War. So the first road is this Huron Road Turnpike. And by the way, a turnpike, that was to pay for the road. And it was really a pole across the road, and once you paid the toll, they turned the pike, which happens to be why we call it a turnpike today. But another one. But anyway, that road would eventually become Detroit. And as a lot of you probably know, many of our streets tell you where you're going. That's going to Detroit. The Tri-C Turnpike was Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati. You get that all together. Broadway was originally Pittsburgh Street. Euclid was originally Buffalo Street. They are kind of told. Lorraine goes to Lorraine, Ohio, and so on. But anyway, again, I lost my train of thought.
So we're going back to...
It happens. You get old.
We start with religion and we get to turnpike.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
So just if you could just tell us from the very beginning, why the church was, the first church was founded on the west side, and then the division between the two on each side.
I have to bring it up to the township. The last straw, we were talking about the draws, the last straw after the western part of the Western Reserve was mapped out happens in 1807. And a Connecticut investor by the name of Samuel Philip Lord pulls all of what would become Brooklyn Township. In fact, he sends his son and his son-in-law, Richard Lord and Josiah Barber, to come out to develop the land. They come out in 1818. That's that same year that Trinity Brooklyn is made into a church. That's the connection. But that's why they're calling it Brooklyn, because at that time in 1818, the township is called Brooklyn. What's a township? A township is a 5 by 5 mile area. Brooklyn Township goes from the north, Lake Erie, east, Ohio River. The west would be West 117th Street today, and the south would be Brook Park Road. It's a large area, and anything in that area can be called Old Brooklyn because that's where they're coming from. So the church called Trinity Brooklyn, that's what they're referring to, the township name Brooklyn.
And the original name of the area, I think that's important for people, just as a historical trivia.
Egypt. Is that what you're asking?
Egypt.
There were two major families that settled the west side very early on, and they really went to what is called Brooklyn Village or Brooklyn Center, south on West 25th Street near Denison. And there were a lot of families. The families were basically either the Brainerd family or the Fish family. We had a lot of those out there, a lot of Fish and a lot of Brainards. One of the Brainards, though, thought it would really, really be cool if we called this is 1818, if we called the township Egypt, because they planted a lot of corn in this township, and back then corn was a broad term, by the way. It was grains, all kinds of things included under that title. A lot of people thought, cute idea, but no, that doesn't sound quite so good. So they chose, and there's no real reason for this other than it sounded good. They called it Brooklyn. And it was not a homage to New York's Brooklyn at all, because most of these people were from Connecticut. So I don't know why exactly Brooklyn, but it was Brooklyn.
Okay, and now
the churches.
The churches.
Okay, we'll get to it.
Keep pushing on that.
We'll get to the churches. Okay, now, here's where the rivalry begins. In 1818, we have Trinity Brooklyn. 1820, we have these two churches on either side of the valley, and they're both called Trinity. The congregation said enough, and I don't know why on the west side they won, but they won. And in 1820, the congregation said, let's have one permanent location. And so in 1820, they decide that Trinity Brooklyn is going to be the permanent location for our Episcopal Church. And so they do that, and also in the records they say, from this point forward, we're not going to use the word Cleveland in any of our records. So I think this is the first poke in the eye to Cleveland. Now, this is 1820, and it would remain that way until 1825. 1825, the state of Ohio, this is where we get into the canal. Yeah? No?
No,
Not yet?
No, well, so...
But this is why the church, though. The canal is why.
Why don't we get into the canal right now? Could you first explain why the canal was important? Because obviously, we said this last week when we talked, that this was probably, forget LeBron, forget the Browns leaving, this was the most important thing to ever happen to Cleveland, bar none.
Yeah, well... To put us on the map, yes, and it's really, I would imagine, and there's not anyone in this room that Cleveland had a canal? Yes, in fact, the canal is why we're here. And why a canal? Well, the first modes of transportation for industry were water-powered, and so the idea of a canal is a water-powered, man-made trench. It was 40 foot wide, average, and it was 26 at the base of it. It was about 4 foot deep, and it was dug along the side of a body of water. Erie Canal is being built. 1825, it's complete, connecting New York with Lake Erie through Buffalo, New York. The state of Ohio said, we got to do that. In fact, many of the states...
New York to Lake Erie through Buffalo.
Yes.
That was the first one.
That's 1825. And that same year that opens is when Ohio announces we're going to do one, but ours is going to go north-south. And Cleveland won the northern terminus for that construction. And it would run from Lake Erie all the way through the state of Ohio, catching other rivers to feed into it until it got to the Ohio River in 1832. The canal's built 1825 to 1832. And golden days were here when that happened, because as soon as we hit the Ohio River, all the trade coming in from New York Harbor could now come through the Erie Canal to Lake Erie, down through Cleveland, down to the Ohio River, to the Mississippi, to New Orleans. We were the crossroads for all goods and farming between New Orleans and New York came through Cleveland.
So it could go the other way as well.
Oh, yeah, right. It's the whole idea of being a network that's going to pass through this area.
And so for everybody this is the slide up that right now, just to illustrate how important Cleveland was as a central point for that canal.
And as a footnote for that, stepping into the next step on the rivalry, and we'll get back to the churches too in a minute, but the rivalry kind of laces together here. When the canal was announced in 1825, the engineers said, okay, well, Cleveland's got it, but it's not going to be in Cleveland. The easiest and most inexpensive way of actually terminating the Ohio Canal in this area is on the west side of the Cuyahoga River. Well, I'm sure those people in those cabins were jumping up and down, yay, we're getting all this business is going to come to us. Well, wait a minute. Cleveland was always much larger population-wise, and the business community of Cleveland, we're talking again, the canal's 1825, is saying, wait a minute, how much would it cost to change the mouth of the canal from the west side to the east side? Oh, $6,000. We can do that, and so the canal doesn't empty on the west of the side of the Cuyahoga River where Ohio City would be. It empties on the east side in Cleveland. And so now there's a poke in the eye to the Cleveland, or the Ohio City folks on that side, or the West Siders.
So there were two possibilities. The canal could have it was coming up from the Ohio River. It could have ended on the west side or the east side. And because the east side had more money and they were willing to pay for it,
exactly,
the canal was diverted to the east side.
Right.
And the business went there, and so they needed warehouses and they needed workers. And is that essentially the story?
That's essentially the story. Also a footnote, today on the east side rather, downtown, we call it the warehouse district. Well, that's kind of an echo of the actual function of the canal when it was part of Cleveland. A lot of the goods came in, had to be housed in warehouses, and so we end up with the warehouse district as kind of an echo of that today. What else was I going to say about the... the canal itself, once it opened, the Cleveland really put all their eggs into that basket. Oh, we're going to commerce on the canal is going to make us golden, and so we're not doing anything with the west side at this point. Let's just go with the river and the canal. What that did, though, it really isolated the west side. They couldn't be part of that. Things that were happening on the west side, it wasn't dull over here at this time. With this canal, we too became valuable land. The Buffalo Land Company, people from Buffalo, New York, they were prospering from the Erie Canal. And so they're looking to Cleveland saying, oh, they're getting a new canal, let's jump into it. So they come and they buy all of Westgate Island in 1831. So we have outsiders coming in and buying large tracts of land on the west side now. Overnight, we become developed because of this canal.
What did they plan on doing with that land?
Well, they were dividing it up and going to sell it themselves. The Buffalo Land Company from the beginning thought, someday these two cities are going to merge and we're going to make lots of bucks with one big city at the mouth of the Cuyahoga as a major port. So it was an investment. But because of that investment, by the way, both Cleveland and the west side would jump way ahead of all the other towns east of us, like Painesville and Youngstown, that really started very early on. But because of this investment, because of this canal, Cleveland and the west side would really eclipse them totally.
So we're going to take a pause right now. If you do have questions on anything that's been said so far, this is what we meant. There's just so much information that's coming out. Please write them down on your cards and pass them back over to Hallie or bring them on down. So Tim, thinking about this canal, at this point there's not giant earth movers. There's not machines that are doing this work. But it sounds like it was, if they're digging 4 feet down for miles and miles and miles and building locks and essentially creating new rivers for industry and highways, that's a lot of work. Is that, and so who was doing that work?
The canal is going to also, I should say, when Cleveland is developed as a village and when the first settlers come to the west side, they're basically New Englanders. They're basically from Connecticut. But with the building of the canal, we're going to have our first wave of immigration to this area because that canal is not going to be built by the New Englanders. They were looking for cheap labor. And fortunately for them, the Irish, in large number, were being suppressed and starved and so on. And we start the great immigration of the Northwest Europeans, start with the canal, a little bit bit later, the Germans would come as well. And they're going to add great diversity to this area. And again, because of the construction of the canal. The canal, not only in its construction, was a job creator. Because of all the investment and the businesses that were going in, it was job opportunities for the immigrants. So now we're addressing and bringing in people from, basically, in this case, German, a lot of the Germans and a lot of the Irish are coming about the time of the canal.
And so where did they settle and what did they end up doing? If there are business opportunities and they have to live somewhere.
Well, I think I need to go into the rivalry.
Churches.
And I'll get to the churches. In 18th, and sacred architecture is one of my focus, so I've got to get to it at some point. But anyway, in 1831, I mentioned the development is getting really big in the area. In 1834, because Cleveland had the canal, what was left for this side of town? Well, we're going to go industrial. And so in 1834, the Cuyahoga Steam Furnace Company is chartered. We're now moving away from water power to the very beginnings of steam-powered industry. And so the Industrial Revolution is just beginning to peek its head up in the kinds of things that are going on the west side of Cleveland. Between that kind of company, the industry, shipbuilding is going to be a big deal on this side of town as well. Because of that last slip in the Cuyahoga River, that becomes a sheltered harbor for the building of ships. And so again, so many job opportunities would allow all these folks to get in here. Now, in 1835, the city of Cleveland is growing so quickly, and so is Ohio, so is the west side, that they decide, why don't we incorporate? Why don't we become a city, an incorporated city, and maybe we should drag along this west side area. And by the way, they refer to the west side as the village of Brooklyn. It was not officially that, but that's how they referred to it because it was in Brooklyn Township. And so just before, in Ohio City...
At that point, they were thinking about joining together as one unified city.
That's right, and the people on the west side were all for it to begin with, but when they got close to actually making that decision, they had a big meeting in Cleveland, and the Cleveland folks got together and said, if we bring in the west side, they have a lot of these foreign investors from New York and all these others, they're going to end up having too much influence if we merge together at this time. So they said, no, let's forget that idea. So they snubbed the west side. Again, ta-da, the rivalry. Now, the west side knew that Cleveland was about to go to the state to get their charter. They got faster horses and went down to the state. And on March 3rd, the city of Ohio was created, Ohio City. It wasn't a village first, jumped right to the cityhood. And by the way, they were still villages. The actual population at that time was 2,000 people in Ohio City. But nevertheless, they got a state charter, and they beat Cleveland out by 2 days. 2 days later, Cleveland becomes the village. Ha ha, poke in the eye.
It becomes a city.
Becomes a city, I'm sorry, yes. The other things that occurred, I'd like someone else to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I've looked, it seems because of the advancement of this area that Ohio City, it was a big deal. When the census came around during the 20s, and 1820, 1830, 1840, you wanted to get everyone counted so you could say, hey, look how great we are, we're growing, come invest with us. So it was a big deal to take on labels like that. So the idea of becoming the first city was a big deal. In fact, I believe Ohio City is the first city in the Western Reserve by 2 whole days, but still for them it was a big deal, and that's why Cleveland was probably very upset knowing all along, hey, we're 3 times the size of that little upstart across the river. We're going to be the first city in this area. They were late by 2 days, as usual.
It was a pride thing.
It was a pride thing.
So thinking back to it, so how did people get back? And you said there was a big meeting on the east side. How were people getting back and forth across the river at that time?
Very good. There was one bridge that was built in 1822. It was a floating bridge at the bottom of Superior Hill near Center Street. It was an agreed upon cooperation between both sides of the river. Cleveland had their side. It was a floating bridge on pontoons, and Ohio City had its side, and they would pull them aside when ships wanted to go up and down the Cuyahoga. So that was the first bridge, and that's 1822. Other than that, it was very difficult to get back and forth between the two sides. 1836, by the way, is when Ohio City and Cleveland both become cities. That is such an important year in our history, 1836. So many things happen. When Ohio City, for example, decides, we didn't get the Ohio Canal, let's build our own. And down on the flats on the west side, they looked right across where the canal came out right into the Superior Street Bridge today. And right across from it on the Ohio City side, there's the powerhouse down the flats. That was all part of Ohio City. And by the way, Ohio City's boundaries, middle of the Cuyahoga River would be its eastern boundary. The northern boundary of Ohio City would be Lake Erie. The southern boundary would be Walworth Run, loosely today I-90. And the western boundary of Ohio City is West 58th Street. So it's quite a large area. I think I lost my train of thought again.
Well, we're moving into the 1830s, but I wanted to get to the Bridge War.
Right.
And to set that up so that people could actually understand what that was and how it came about and what ended up happening. So there's a pontoon boat. Each side of the river has their side. The next bridge that was built was what?
We go back to 1836. 1836 was not only the year that Cleveland Ohio City outran Cleveland by 2 days. That same spring, a second bridge was being built in Ohio City on the very southern tip of Ohio City by a Cleveland investor. Clark was his name. He owned land in what was called Cleveland Center, and he also owned land on the very southern tip of Ohio City. He built a 2-section covered bridge with a 19-foot draw. In fact, it's the only covered bridge I can think of that was ever built in Cleveland. And if you think about covered bridges, I looked some of the stuff up. Connecticut claims to have the oldest covered bridge in America. It's 1804. So this is 1836, not that long after that. Of course, New Hampshire says they have the first, and Philadelphia says they have the first as well. But anyway, the idea of a covered bridge, of course, was to protect the superstructure, but also finicky horses that didn't like looking at water. And so you had covered bridges. But this particular bridge did something really nasty. It detoured all the traffic that was coming up into Ohio City, up West 25th Street, Pearl Street at the time, even called Columbus Street at the time, all the goods coming up that route, which connected again Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland, would now detour just at the point where they're going to enter the business district of Ohio City, Lorraine, and West 25th Street. Before that, they're going down the hill, Columbus Street Hill, to this Columbus Street Bridge. Well, you can imagine the business people of Cleveland or Ohio City are saying, what's with this bridge? It's taking away all our business. And so they objected to the fact that the bridge was built 1836. The Cleveland folks, in fact, what they did, they refused to use the bridge. They boycotted the bridge altogether.
The Cleveland folks?
The Ohio City folks boycotted the Columbus Street Bridge. The Cleveland City Council, in retaliation, said, okay, fine. We're going to cut the side of our floating bridge free that's up a ways, and there's only one bridge left. It's this one. You guys are going to have to use this. The Ohio City folks were incensed rather than incest. Oh my God, what did I say? Oh my God.
Back to the churches.
Back to the churches. Thank you. They were upset that they were forced to use this bridge and they were not going to have it. Now, at this point, the Battle of the Bridge is really the title, I think, of this whole year, pretty much, because there were several skirmishes. One of them in particular, supposedly on the 4th of July, some of the Ohio City folks decided we're going to they put a keg of gunpowder under the bridge to blow it up. Didn't go off, did not, of course, make them more friendly to the Cleveland side of it. Eventually, though, I think it's, depending on the source you look at, it's either Halloween, October 31st of 1836, or it's November 1st. We have the real Battle of the Bridge, where the Ohio City folk are going to go down with saws and axes, and they're going to tear this bridge down. The mayor of Cleveland at the time was a guy by the name of Willie. We have Willie Street near the Animal Protective League. That's named after him. He comes down to defend the bridge with a militia. And we have what is called the Battle of the Bridge. And again, all kinds of stories around this battle. They say there was a cannon that was rolled out from the War of 1812. There were sabers that were brought out. There was some bloodshed. There were no fatalities, thank God. There were 3 fatal injuries, supposedly. And then ultimately, the county sheriff had to come in, stop the ruckus, stop the riot, and the whole matter had to be resolved in the courts. But you can imagine, it did not help the relationship between the east side and the west side. And so here we have the rivalry. In fact, it didn't stop there. The very next year, even though the court said you have to restore the bridge and build some other bridges, in the spring of 18...
Restore, you mean it was damaged?
It was damaged, but they're going to... In fact, they had trees and things that they tried to block the entrances, so they had to amend all those things. But in the spring of 1837, the very next year, even after the court said don't mess with the bridge anymore, the Ohio City folks folks that, oh, by the way, we're building a big trench across the entrance of our side of that bridge because we're grading the street. We're putting a cross street, and we need to grade it. And while we do that, we have to put a big trench in it so they couldn't use the bridge again. So eventually they resolved that, but this had a long-lasting effect on both Ohio City and Cleveland. The idea of talking of merger wouldn't come about now for at least a decade. They wouldn't even speak of it.
For 10 years. First there's bloodshed, and at least for 10 years we're not going to merge it. So that's the next step that we want to get to, is that merger, because they went pretty quickly from all-out warfare to getting married. Most of the time it goes the other way around.
Yes.
So how did that merger come about? What was the impetus for actually uniting?
Well, Cleveland always was much, much larger population-wise than Ohio City. And Ohio City always in the back of their mind thought it would be a good thing to be merged with Cleveland. After all, they had all the goods from the canal that was going that direction. And by the way, by the 1850s, and this is where we're getting to now, the 1850s, a new phenomena was occurring in the country. The canal era was about to pass. In fact, I think the canal era only lasted because we had a great financial panic in 1837. This is like a year after Ohio City and Cleveland become cities. We have a financial panic that lasts about 10 years. At that same time, and in the early 1830s, the first charters for building railroads were being pulled. But they couldn't build them because they couldn't afford to, and it dragged it out and dragged it out. Meanwhile, the canal is prospering. But in 1851, the first train runs from Columbus to Cleveland, and as soon as that train got to the city, the canal's days were really numbered. You think about it, a canal runs on water, and what happens in the winter? It freezes, and commerce stops. Also, canal must have a water source, like the Cuyahoga River in our case, to feed it. But a railroad doesn't need to pay attention to the months of the year, usually, and it can run anywhere. So as soon as the railroads are running, the canal is out of sync. Now, this side of town was really prospering during the 1850s. We were building more and more factories, attracting more immigrants to the area. The Cuyahoga Steam Furnace Company is now doing steam-powered locomotives. They're building on the west side now. The east side doesn't have anything like this, but they'd like to buy a locomotive. Here's an interesting story. In the 1850s, there was a pontoon bridge built specifically to get one of those heavy locomotives over to the east side. They had no way to get it over there. And so the newspapers do highlight how people came down. It was festive. Is the engine going to make it across the Cuyahoga River, or isn't it? And they describe how the engineer would rev up the engine and dart at the bridge, and as soon as he hit the pontoons, the whole thing would sink, and everyone would gasp. And then they describe the engineer gunning the engine so that it begins to push up, and the pontoons are going down in the back and shooting up in the front, and he jets towards the east bank and makes it, thank God. What a ridiculous scene, but this is how they had to do it. But in short order after that, they said, you know, we have an idea. Why don't we build another plant on the other side of the river? And they eventually do that. But what I'm trying to say here is that on the west side in Ohio City, because of shipbuilding, because of the iron and the steel iron industries that are building up eventually steel, we're going to be the industrial base, where Cleveland is still hung up with the canal. And even though they're there, they're also seeing, what, this canal is starting to go down. So they're looking across the river to Ohio City saying, wow, they have industry over there. That's probably a good thing. Also something, this I don't understand fully, and that is Cleveland was looking for a new water source, drinking water for the population over there. They did
the river and the lake. I mean, they had water.
The water had to be pumped up from the river so that they could actually filter through. They didn't take it from the river, from the lake rather. The river was not really what you wanted to drink from necessarily. So the idea was the best location, this is what I find interesting, the best location for a water source for Cleveland was in Ohio City. And it might be because of the topography. I assume we're probably higher. And so Cleveland saw not only the industry, but they also saw, oh, a water source over there would be good. As I said before, Ohio City always kind of wanted to be part of the bigger picture and have that tax base that Cleveland offered. Also, they were hoping they'd build a bridge for them connecting the two sides of town. So in 1854, they both vote and decide to join together for mutual benefit, one to the other. Unfortunately, Ohio City didn't get the bigger part of the bargain. Yes, it did bring some of the, I guess, panache of being a larger city, we become a major port. That was another instance, too. If we joined together, they argued the feds would give us more money for our port because we're now a major port when we're joined together. So that was another impetus as well. Now I lost again.
The Union in 1854, the benefits to Ohio City.
Yes, the benefits of Ohio City. Ohio City was still isolated. That valley really was a problem. Think about it in the winter. There was no high-level bridges. So you had to go down the valley. There usually were train tracks. Whatever bridges they were either a drawbridge or a swing bridge. So you were always waiting for traffic. It was a headache. So it was a very difficult thing to get over to the large population of Cleveland. So in a way, Ohio City was kind of isolated and kind of treated like a mere suburb early on, and not what they hoped. But Cleveland would benefit greatly by the merge because with Ohio City, we really pushed Cleveland into the Industrial Revolution. All that industry we had down there, Cleveland's beginning to do it on their own, but this was a great push to excel Cleveland into the Industrial Revolution, and Cleveland eventually would become one of the major manufacturing centers of this country. By the 1910, 1920, we're like the sixth largest city in the country. It's hard to believe today, but that's because of the industry that all started back in the Ohio City days.
Okay, so we did speak about, when we talked earlier, about how when you were growing up, this was the West Side. It wasn't Ohio City. When did it become the West Side, and when did it go back to being called Ohio City?
Can I do the churches?
Yes, you can do the churches. But was it an immediate switch from the city of Ohio to Cleveland's West Side?
Oh, yeah. I can finish that at least. The West Side, after the merger in 1854, this became the West Side. You either lived on the East Side, you lived on the West Side, and it remained that way through the Civil War. And one other thing I should mention, when the Civil War struck, Cleveland was in an ideal position. Ohio City had given all this industry, and what do you need for the war? Well, you need the armaments, you need the elements that are tied to the trains for the soldier, you need food, you need garments, the soldiers' uniforms. All that's going to be manufactured in a place like Cleveland that already was set up to do that kind of thing. And as the Civil War went on, we got more and more businesses to open, again, attracting more and more people to the area. But basically, we were the West Side, you have the East Side, and then after the Civil War, you're eventually going to get the merging of what would become Tremont to our south. And because it's to our south, when I was a kid, that was called the South Side. I lived on the West Side all my life, and I was not part of the near West Side, by the way. I was a West Sider. And if you went far enough out, you became someone from West Park. If you went too far south, you were in South Brooklyn, which today is called Old Brooklyn. So there was really things were simpler back then.
Churches.
Oh, churches, thank you. Oh, my God. I have to go back to 1836, because that's when... I'm sorry. 1836, as I said, was a banner year. I wasn't lying. The Church of St. John, this is the Episcopal Church. The church was, as I said originally, that was Trinity Brooklyn. Then they go over to the east side.
I'm sorry, the Church of the Trinity Brooklyn that we were talking about earlier, that's the Church of St. John?
That becomes St. John's. So they go all the way back to 1816 as Trinity Brooklyn. But when that parish moved over to the east side, they eventually reorganized in 1834 to become St. John's Episcopal Church. 2 years later, 1836, they build the present church that's still standing today on Church and West 26th Street. It is an extremely significant building architecturally. It is a style called the Gothic Revival. It's one of the earliest you're going to find in the country. It is quarried from the actual stone is brought in by the canal. The building itself had all the various prominent Cleveland or the Ohio City people are all associated with it. Over time, it was used as the Underground Railroad. Last spring, they put up a marker in front of the church, marking this as one of the northern terminuses for the Underground Railroad. So it's tied to so many historic facets. I did want to mention about Tim Holcomb.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tim Holcomb is here somewhere in the audience. He is assistant to... The Reverend Patricia Hainan is the rector of St. John's today, and I don't know if she's here. Anyway, Tim's here, and he has a bunch of flyers. I would urge you to take the flyers, and I should point out right now, St. John is not functioning as a traditional church, but it's really reaching out in a way that it's not necessarily a denominational thing. They're looking at services in the neighborhood besides the restoration of the structure, which is very worthy of that effort. It's a very, very significant structure.
Now, one of the other things that we talked about was the church development on the west side as a reflection of the people that were here. Could you go through maybe one or two of the other churches or more,
right,
if you would like to, and describe why they were built and who they were built to serve?
Of course, the first churches are going to be built by the good Yankees, and they're going to be the Protestant churches. Ohio City Methodist was on the corner of 28th and Church Avenue. There's now a car repair where that used to be. And that's right next to St. John's, by the way. And then you had Ohio City Congregational, which was on the corner of West 29th and Detroit. There's an ugly factory standing where that one stood. On Franklin Circle, though, one of the Disciples of Christ Church, the Christian church on Franklin Circle, that congregation goes back to 1842, I believe. So this was Ohio City when they're founded. That church is built 1874. When the Irish and the Germans come, now we're going to have all kinds of denominations added to the mix. We're going to have, the Germans are going to bring in Lutherans and Methodists, and the Jews are going to come in the 1840s because of the Germans. The Irish, many of them are Roman Catholic. So here in Ohio City, we're going to have the Church of St. Patrick on Bridge Avenue, which is going to be the mother church for all the Irish. In 1865, a second church is built for the Irish, by the way, right along the edge of the bluff, St. Malachy's, which is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year. I should point out, when St. Patrick's was founded on Bridge Avenue, in 1853, by the way, this was Ohio City when St. Patrick's was founded, I think that was done deliberately because the Irish were not really known for living in the heart of the neighborhood. They were a lot of them were not seen as very desirable, so they pushed them to the edge of the community. Irish Town, the Irish Angle, along the bluffs and along Detroit and West 25th Street. And the very first Roman Catholic bishop of the city of Cleveland, he was not Irish, he was not German, he was French. Amadeus Rapp was his name. And he thought the best way to make his flock compete with the Yankees, who had set up the status quo, was to make them more like that. So what does he do for the Irish on the west side? He doesn't put the church down where they were, down in the Angle area. The very first church is on Bridge Avenue, right in the heart of Ohio City, near Fulton and Bridge. That's a mile away from where most of them were. He was forcing them up into the heart of the neighborhood. I think it was deliberate. And the people that were still down there were demanding their own church, and eventually St. Malachy's is founded, 1865. And between the two congregations, you had some rift. In fact, the people from St. Patrick's were often referred to as the lace curtain Irish up on the hill from those from St. Malachy's.
So the idea, in your theory, the idea was that the Irish were living down closer to the river. They were working in the factories down there. They weren't getting too much out of what essentially could have been a village in Ireland for all the Irish that were living down there. And he was saying, you need to acclimatize to the American way of life, and you need to learn more about what people do here so that you can become more like the Americans.
Exactly. In fact, he didn't believe in the national ethnic parish idea, and that's really weird because that's what he had. So he wasn't really popular, actually. Eventually, the Germans and the Irish get together in 1870 when he was at the First Vatican Council held in Rome, and they petitioned the Pope, please don't send this man back. And Amadeus Rapp is removed from the city of Cleveland. He goes back to Vermont in 1877. He dies, and after he dies, I guess people here felt he was safe, and they brought his body back, and he's in the crypt at the cathedral downtown. So there you go.
So with the numbers of Irish and Catholics on the west side, why is the center of the Catholic Church now on the east side?
The first church was, Bishop Rapp established the cathedral on Erie Street and Superior, East 9th and Superior. So he built that, and that's 1840. That structure underneath all the layers of that building today is the original 1852 Cathedral of St. John. So that's where the cathedral started. The west side was still a little slow. There were a lot of Irish over here, but as I said, the bishop said, we're not going to put the church where the Irish are concentrated. We're going to put it up away from them, and eventually St. Malachy's would be established to address the others. I should also point out, coming in greater numbers were the Germans. We seem not to celebrate the Germans, but the Germans would outnumber the Irish throughout the 19th century until the turn of the century when the Polish would outnumber them. But the Germans would set up many different denominations. If you look at the churches in Ohio City, you'll have Trinity Evangelical Lutheran on West 30th across from St. Ignatius. St. Ignatius is a Jewish institution, is a German institution of Jesuits. I'm getting tired. A German institution established by Jesuits and opened in 1886. Then you get across the street from them St. Mary's, which was a German Roman Catholic church, the first one, and that was founded in 1865. And then not too far from that, the Church of St. Stephen on West 54th Street is a magnificent structure. The woodwork inside of it is unsurpassed for a Victorian structure. You really, really should take the time and see that particular structure. So we have several very significant structures, sacred structures within Ohio City.
Okay. So you mentioned the Irish angle. Could you describe what that is? And is that related to the old angle now?
Well, it's actually, no, I think the name is taken and moved up the street, but I don't think that's it. The Irish angle was really around the opening for the Superior Viaduct. You know, those great arches you see in the flats, that's the Superior Viaduct. I probably should do that. The Superior Viaduct, this was the bridge that Ohio City had been promised way back in 1854. They were promised a new bridge in 2 years after they merged in 1854. It didn't happen, and it didn't happen. Then we have little things like the Civil War and the depressions that happened here, there, and everywhere. Eventually, in 1873, 7,000 people protest on Franklin Circle, saying, Cleveland, you told us you were going to give us a bridge. We demand a bridge. We're not going to patronize any of your businesses unless you give us the bridge. December 27th, 1878, the Superior Viaduct opens to great ceremony. It must have been cold. This is after Christmas. But this is the first high-level bridge to connect the east side and the west side. It's the first time they could travel easily from one side of the river to the other. It was quite significant.
And now that you mention it, Franklin's, and this is, we have just a few more questions, and then we'll get to the questions that were asked. Franklin Circle, one of the things that always confused me was that Franklin Circle isn't a circle. And I always just wanted to know, like, what was it about the area that they called it Franklin Circle?
I'll do the circle as part of the street patterns in Ohio City. The street patterns of Ohio City are totally different than Cleveland's. If you look at a map of Cleveland and Ohio City, you will notice that the street patterns are wacky in Ohio City. And that is because we're part of what was called canal fever back to the canal. When the canal was being developed, Lord & Barber sold off large chunks of land. You know, the Buffalo Land Company buys land, other investors buy land, and there was no master plan for streets. So you were free to put the streets together any way you wanted in your little part of the west side. And so that's why you'll have some of the grid patterns are parallel to a bend in the river, some are parallel to the lake, and right in the middle of it, Richard Lord decided, I'm keeping the best for myself, and I don't want any of these grids that are going on. I'm going to go with the French idea of a circle with radiating streets coming off of it. And that's why East Siders that come to the west side may never find their way back home again for the maze that is Ohio City. But it's because of the canal fever that caused the crazy patterns. You know, have an intersection like Fulton and Lorraine where 5 streets will come together at one point. It's because of this crazy lack of plan on the west side. The circle itself was a circle. It's laid out 1836. It was used for many things, a park as well as the first open-air market. Lord & Barber did many, many things. They set aside land for a cemetery, Monroe Street Cemetery, 1836, there's that year again. 1840, they sent a parcel of land on the corner of Lorraine and West 25th as the market site. This is the beginning of the West Side Market, starts 1840. Right after the Civil War, 1868, the city builds the first market house. That is the West Side Market. It was called the Pearl Street Market at the time. All those the newspapers often just called it the West Side Market. The present market was built in 1912, and the celebration we had just a few years ago was the celebration of that building, the second market built for the West Side Market. The West Side Market goes back either to 1840, when it was Ohio City, or if you want to go back to buildings, the very first building for the West Side Market was the Pearl Street Market, built shortly after the Civil War, 1868.
So the West Side Market owes its existence to Lord and Barber in Franklin Circle.
Yes.
And it wasn't even there was no market house or anything there.
Not on Franklin Circle, no. Franklin Circle would develop into a more fashionable park over time. It was a traffic circle at one point. It had a fence put around it. There was a fountain on Public Square. When they actually built that reservoir, the water was pumped under the Cuyahoga River, and there was a fountain on Public Square. It controlled all the water, including that fountain. Eventually, that fountain would be brought over to Franklin Circle. It would end up there. And by the way, that reservoir, the reservoir, because Cleveland grew so quickly, was outmowed in a very short time. So eventually, they tear it down. There's one photo I know of showing the demolition of the reservoir. Was like a pyramid, big mound with a top cut off, filled with water. The pump plant was down where it is today, right off the Shoreway. Same location. Pumped the water up to Franklin and 38th. When it was demolished in the early 20th century, they actually built a little steam railroad down to West 38th Street, Kentucky Street, from the reservoir, which is now the Gardens, the Kentucky Street Gardens. They actually emptied the dirt into the train, and the train went down to the lake and dumped it into the lake, and that's how they flattened it. By the way, back to the Germans briefly, right next to the reservoir were two mansions. By the early 20th century, by the way, let me go back to I'm sorry, there's just too much stuff. What can I say? The top of the reservoir had such a wonderful view that the Victorians would actually go up the central stair. There was a staircase up to this platform, which kind of was a walkway around the reservoir, and they'd get this fair view from the top of the reservoir. Now, next, yes, I can hear the minds clicking out there. There were two houses. One house, the houses were purchased eventually. One became a hospital, and it was a big sign on the outside of it. It said German Hospital. It was a deaconess, I think, did it originally, but it's a German hospital. It's a German hospital on it. Then we have World War I. And by this time now, the reservoir is being flattened. But during World War I, it wasn't too cool to be called German anything. So this big sign on the front of the hospital wasn't a neat thing to have. So they decided, we have to change the name of our hospital. Well, next to them was where the reservoir was, which had become a park named Fairview Park, after the view from the top of the once reservoir that stood there. So they decided they're going to call themselves Fairview Park Hospital. And that's how that name comes about. By the 1950s, they built a nursing school next to them. And then ultimately, in the late 1950s, they moved to the very western end of the west side of Cleveland, across from a suburb. It's Fairview Park today. And a lot of people mistakenly think, oh, it's because that's the name for the hospital. They're right across from that suburb. No, it's this little park in Ohio City called Fairview Park today.
Now, getting back to that Ohio City, we went from the city of Ohio to the west side. When did it become Ohio City again? Because I think that most of the people here, and myself definitely included, would have just assumed that it was always Ohio City and that was the neighborhood of Cleveland.
Right. Putting things in context, the Tremont area would not really start until the last years of Ohio City. Ohio City is going to merge 1854. Tremont was really a farm area until the early 1850s, when Professor Asa Mahan from Oberlin was thrown out of Oberlin, and he came to Cleveland with a lot of support from sponsors who bought up land in what is Tremont to lay out a new Cleveland University for Asa Mahan, his president. And so they lay out the streets in Tremont. You'll find professor and literary and college, all that good stuff. That happens in the 1850s, right at the point when Ohio City is now going to become part of Cleveland. Detroit Shoreway, that area, part of that would become the village of West Cleveland. That wouldn't happen until after the Civil War in '71. And so by the mid-20th century, as I said before, we were basically east side, west side, south side. That was about it. During the 1970s, when now people are moving out to the suburbs, the area is going down. By the 1970s, there was an interest on the part of the city. It was called the Strategic Planning Initiative, or Strategic Planning Areas. They broke the city up into small areas. Federal block grant money was coming to the communities. And so they wanted them to have names. And so, for example, Tremont decided to call itself Tremont. You have a small street there with a school called Tremont. Tremont has so many names. And it was South Side, it was Lincoln Heights, it was University Heights, it was Scranton Heights, it was Heights. That's all Tremont. This area, Ohio City, in the late 1960s, there was someone that did some research and realized this was a separate municipality from Cleveland on the other side of the river. And so they start exploring and realizing more and more of its own history. During the early 1970s, it became more and more popular because we're about to celebrate our bicentennial as a nation. And so the idea of anything American was cool. And so the idea of preserving or restoring Ohio City became an interest of a lot of people in the 1970s. And so the name is revived. And then we keep going, and that's why we're here.
So as a part of the marketing
Oh, yes.
structure.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So then the second question, before we get to the questions from the audience, is one of the things that I think a lot of people will notice about Ohio City is that it does have its own flag. Is that historical at all? I mean, like, is it?
Oh, God.
Is it what do the stars mean? I mean, like, what?
Oh, my
what does
God.
What is the flag of Ohio City?
The flag is a contemporary design. I think it's a very nice design, and I don't know. I should know, but I don't know. Bob, do you know?
I don't think many people do.
Yeah, I think it was kind of a group effort. I'm guessing on the number of stars. I have no idea. It just looks nice. I've always liked the shape of the Ohio State flag, and I think it echoes that, of course,
So
in its
for one
shape.
of the people that knows the most about Ohio
I don't
City,
know. You got me. I don't know.
Fantastic. Okay, so two questions then that came from the audience. One was, why was the change from Cleveland, C-L-E-A-V-E land, to Cleveland, C-L-E-V-E-L-A-N-D?
That has, again, that's one of those things that, make up something. I mean, there's been so many stories around, and one of them is that one of the early newspapers ran out of A's, and so you drop the A from Cleveland. There's many of them. I'm not quite sure which one. I've heard so many I've forgotten at this point. But yes, Moses Cleveland spelled his name C-L-E-A-V-E-L-E-L-A-N-D, and the A, the first A, was dropped at some point. But as to why, I'm not sure.
Okay, the second question, and there's two questions, correct? Oh, okay. That would be fantastic. What part of the city today were farm fields, and what did they grow?
Good question. Most of them were farm areas early on. To give you an example, I live on Whitman, which is one of the nicest pedestrian streets in Ohio City, of course. But Whitman originally, like so many of the areas, was farm area. Henry Whitman had an orchard, actually. In fact, he's noted for having a specialty apple that he grew on his orchard. But Whitman was a street that had a lot of property that Henry owned. In the 1850s, he began cutting up his orchard area and selling it off for the building of houses along Whitman. And by the way, at that time, the street was not called Whitman. It was called Merchant Street, I believe, after Asa Mahan, who actually put the 1835 map that shows both Ohio City and Cleveland together. His first map that shows it is the the Merchant's map. But after Cleveland and Ohio City merged, Cleveland, of course, if they were the big guy in town, and they already had a street named Merchant, they said, well, you got Merchant, you're going to have to change that name. And it just so happens that Whitman owned a lot of property, and my guess is because he owned so much property, the name becomes Whitman as it is today. And by the way, if you go to the Monroe Street Cemetery, which has a wonderful, beautiful gatehouse that has been restored recently, and the wonderful Gothic arches to it, the very first large monument is an Egyptian obelisk as you enter the cemetery, and it's Whitman. It's the Whitman who the street's named after.
So two questions relating to the Native Americans. First, what happened to them? And how much of the Western expansion was due to the disregard of treaties with the tribes that were here?
I think it's the same old story. I don't think it's any different here than it was in any other part of the country. There were treaties. When Moses Cleveland came, for example, in 1796, part of what he did is sign a treaty with the Indians that were there at the time to free up the east half of the Western Reserve. The western half of the Western Reserve, that treaty's not signed until 1805, and there weren't enough Indians on the west side to justify the treaty. They had to go out all the way out to the Maumee River near Toledo to sign the treaty to free up the western half of the Western Reserve. Most of the Indians, the last battle of that sort in the state of Ohio happened in 1794, the Battle of Fallen Timbers along the Maumee River near Toledo, and that was an amalgamation of whatever tribes were left. The Five Nations tribe was the Iroquois. They really were dominating in the area. The Erie Indians had long been dissipated, but by the time the first settlers get here, there really aren't many that they're seeing.
And so the last question, I think it's an interesting one. You mentioned a lot of different European groups that came here, but the question was, what effect, if any, did the historical East-West rivalry between the two cities have on the later east-west racial divide, and you look like it's
Whoa,
a big question.
It's a big question. I do want to say, just to bring the second half of the immigration to the area. The last quarter of the 19th century, we have the second great wave of immigration to Cleveland, and those would be the Central and Southern Europeans. And so that's when we get the Hungarians, St. Emmerich's behind the West Side Market, for example, the Slovaks, St. Wendelins. So we're getting that diversity. As you go further west, you're going to get the Italians. So they're all coming in at that time. As far as the rivalry between East Side and West Side, I just think it was a popular thing for the longest time. The East Side always looked down on the West Side, I think. Being a West Sider, I kind of felt that. But as far as the division in the division between East Side and West Side, population-wise, I don't know what to say to that.
Well, I think even if you felt looked down upon, then I think everybody east side, west side, or south side here is looking up to you.
I'm sorry, one more thing, and I know the people at the Western Reserve Historical Society are going to hate me. I used to work there. But one of the wonderful things of working at the Western Reserve Historical Society are the collections. They're just wonderful. They're just great. And one of the benefits of working there, during your lunchtime, you could actually go up and look at the stacks of all the wonderful photographs and the documents, and I would spend many lunches just looking at this stuff. But then I would see a pattern. You would see a photograph of this wonderful building, and I would recognize it, but it was labeled unknown. It was the Lisey Brewery house just south of Walworth Run. It was a West Side brewery, and I could identify it, but because it was a West Side situation, there were so many times I ran across unknown, because there was a bias on the East Side. The West Side elements, I'm not saying they were all that way, but I would find more missing on the West Side than on the East Side. They'd have images, but not quite identify them at the time. Anyway.
Well, like I was saying, I think we're all looking up to you right now. It's a testament to your ability to speak quickly and get information. We're close to being exactly on time, just a few minutes over.
Excellent.
So if you could all put your hands together and help me thank Tim. We want to talk about the present and future of Ohio City in this section. So I wanted to ask each of you, just coming down the line, from your own personal perspectives, what are the greatest assets currently in Ohio City that are helping move it forward? So Brenda, if you want to start and then pass the microphone to your left and right.
I can talk about Lakeview, some of Lakeview's assets that we have. Is we're down there at near Malachi. We're kind of like cut off from the rest of the place because we're kind of like hidden, but we're there, and we have where we're at now. You can go, take you 5 minutes. You can go walk down in the flats, and you can go to any area you want to. You can go to the new restaurants, the aquarium, the nautical stage. You can go to anything that's available on the west side. Also, we have a community center there. And it has on the outside of it, has Indian artifacts on the outside. It's also historical too. And sometimes if you like, come down sometime and look at it. It's right on West 25th Street. You come straight down past Malachi, and you can see the building right on the side. All of that's there. We have mainly that's about all the assets that we have in our area.
Fantastic. So could you pull the microphone out and then just pass it to Stephanie, and then we'll switch to the other side. It comes out that way. There you go. And Stephanie, if you could also, we know Brenda's from the north side. Could you explain your area as well? But when you're
I'm from the muchly discussed neighborhood Hingetown, but I was really glad to hear that we were talking a little bit about how neighborhoods get names, because in Hingetown, I won't take too long, but Hingetown gets a bad rap because somebody gave it a name, and that is just how things get named. So it was nice to hear that. But from my perspective, the people that I work with on a daily basis, who are really kind of the entrepreneurs and small business owners that will have passion enough to take a risk on building something in a neighborhood and do something that maybe doesn't seem like it's viable to other people. That's, I think, the biggest asset that we have. That's kind of a Cleveland asset, not just Ohio City.
Bob, if you could also just describe sort of the perspective that you're bringing, the people that you're working with.
Certainly. I'd like to just kind of piggyback onto what Brenda Tate was talking about. And I think our assets are really the human asset. And my years as a community organizer, I learned that the residents at Lakeview, the Lakeview Family Units, the Lakeview Tower, and CMHA's Riverview Towers, there's a great human asset that lives in public housing. Tim spoke eloquently about migration in this city, the Irish immigrants and later the Eastern Europeans, but Cleveland was also a destination for a lot of people from the South, seeking to get away from the oppression of life in the South, especially African Americans in the South. And Cleveland was the promised land. And many of those people that currently live on CMHA property have a rich history of that migration from the South. Now, certainly not all the residents there are from the South, but there's numerous people I've talked to that migrated to Cleveland from the South. And that's a real part, I think, of our heritage. Also, too, just it's interesting, too, that Tim talked about the Irish immigrants, but they settled in some of the shanties on the hillside that now currently is also being occupied by our homeless population down by Riverbed Road. We now have homeless people living down there that at one time that was where Irish people lived. And it's our probably current bottom of the totem pole population, and population I'm also trying to currently do outreach to. Just a wealth of human assets in this neighborhood, and I think especially we are steeped in social activism. Ohio City became a hotbed of just all types of activism, and I think that is a real testament and a real legacy to the people of Ohio City.
Fantastic, thanks. And Sam, you're a different representative as a major bar owner and brewery owner here. What are the assets that you see that Ohio City has, and why are you here in the first place?
Well, I'm mostly here for the beer. I will say this is an incredibly hard act to follow. So, Andrew, you're asking a lot of the four of us to follow Tim's brilliant discussion, and I thank you both for bringing that to the forefront. And that was fascinating. I'm glad we're capturing it on video for posterity. So assets. I mean, I think the common narrative thread we're hearing is that it's all about people, right? Everything we do is always about people. You could have the sticks and bricks, and while that's important to a degree, it doesn't matter unless you have the right people inside those sticks and bricks and in those neighborhoods and making things happen. And we talked about all the waves of immigrants from various countries. Cleveland right now in general, Ohio City in particular, is this kind of post-industrial frontier where we've seen the exodus of manufacturing jobs, leaving a lot of vacant buildings. So one of the real attractions in Ohio City when we first, my business partners and I first came down here was that the real estate was very affordable. It's a dense, urban, walkable neighborhood. And so my background is in planning, not beer, believe it or not. So I interned years ago with Ohio City Inc. in my undergraduate degree, and I was like, wow, this neighborhood is amazing. Why is it boarded up and vacant and largely destitute? So years later, coming down here, there was an opportunity to really have some fun, basically taking dilapidated buildings and injecting new life in them.
So you're talking about sticks and bricks. You had the infrastructure that you needed to start doing things down here. I'd say to enable the people to start doing things down here as well.
Correct, exactly.
Okay. Fantastic. So the second question, we'll start on that end and then bring it back down here. What challenges does Ohio City face moving forward? Again, from your personal perspective and the demographic or the people that you're speaking from.
I would say one of the biggest challenges is we're running out of, and it's a good challenge, good problem, we're running out of real estate. So developers are looking everywhere to answer the call to create more housing, and it's been very difficult to find buildable sites. So if you can make more land in Ohio City, figure out a way and do it, because we need more housing down here. And really a lot of what we're talking about is and Tim can attest to this. What we're doing down here is actually just reinventing the past with a modern twist. So there used to be 30-some breweries in Ohio City. And right now we're at a small fraction of that, and we're considered the brewery district of Cleveland, and thankfully so. It's a great place to live and enjoy that. But I mean, we're reinventing the past. There used to be density like we couldn't imagine. Every one of these houses, instead of having 2 or 3 people in them, would have had maybe 10 or 15. So when we look at the development, it's kind of starting to come back. We're seeing vertical development because folks no longer live like that. We don't pack 15 people in a house, but if we can build vertically and recreate the past in that sense, and again, putting my planning hat on, public transportation's a big piece of it. Being able to have bike lanes, walkable neighborhoods, parks, green space. This is all basically reinventing what Ohio City was 100+ years ago.
Okay, fantastic. And so I'm happy to have Bob and Brenda coming after you, because Sam, and you might not remember this conversation, I do. Years ago we were talking, and...
was I sober?
I don't know. But years ago we were talking, and it was just after you'd started NanoBrew. And I remember asking you, did anybody from the buildings north of NanoBrew ever come into any of your bars? And it took you a minute, and you said, I don't know. I probably not. I don't think so. And so the challenges from your perspective of where do we need more land to build on. I'm really excited to hear any sort of counterpoints that Bob or Brenda might be able to bring up with that. So Bob and Brenda, the challenges that you see Ohio City facing.
Well, I think our most significant challenge right now is beyond just the demand for housing, but it's crime and safety. And I kind of established myself in this community as an advocate for all residents that are concerned about crime and safety issues. When I was hired at the time it was Ohio City Near West Development, now OCI, I was the staff community organizer and safety coordinator. And I learned early on as a victim of crime myself that building bridges with the Cleveland Police was a huge asset that paid huge dividends, just having a strong relationship with the Cleveland Police. And I've really developed that over the years, to the point now that I know the various commanders that have been at the district, and the command staff, and the officers that patrol our streets. And it's all about building bridges. As much about community building with all people that live in Ohio City, from yeah, right. But community building with the residents, the homeowners, the renters, the people that live in public housing, our homeless population, and the Cleveland Police. The Cleveland Police are an important part of our community. And there was a time that I didn't like the police. I had a bad attitude about them. But then I learned quickly that they're human beings just like all of us, and they are here to protect and serve. So I've developed this relationship with the police to see if we can have some impact on crime and safety in our community, which is, I think, our real Achilles heel. And now with that relationship with the police, they've been a huge asset to our homeless outreach activities, both generating donations to the homeless population that live in our community, but they've been actually taking care of homeless individuals that are undergoing a mental health crisis. So it's, again, building bridges with the police has been a huge part of what I do. And I think, if we all band together, we can really get our hands around neighborhood crime and safety. And a big part of that is getting to know your neighbors, all your neighbors, and including the residents that are kind of cut off to the north at Lakeview Terrace. So that's all part of community building. Building a strong community is going to make it a safer community.
Well, luckily we have somebody from those terraces to follow up on that. So, Brenda?
Yes. Our community is where we're sitting at. It's always been known to be prime land. Everybody's always wanted our land We've had the Jacobs brothers, people have brought us signs, layouts saying what did they want to do, and was going to be high income, low income, living together. And then we found out that that wasn't true. You know, they're trying to get rid of us. Also, we have a problem. We fear for our where we stay right now. Right now, we're having a problem with the trucks. Where Maine and Washington comes up, they want to make the trucks, ODOT trucks, come all the way up there, don't stop at all, come all the way up the street, swerve around, come up Detroit and come down. We have children that goes to Malachi's programs. How are they supposed to get there? Also, we have residents walk up that area. You know, we really have a problem right now. On 28th Street, they want all the traffic to come down 28 coming down. Okay, they're going to make the bike path come down Detroit, come around and come down Washington. That's where we live at, a part of Lakeview. If they do that, they're going to mess the bike people up, you know, because trucks coming out through there, the cars coming through. When we first did that, when I first moved over there, they had at rush hour, they had a gate that they used to close off there at a certain time. And at a certain time, they would open that gate back up, and it was never no problem. Now, all of a sudden, this is something, they took the gate away, it's been a problem. Also, we had the salt mine there. Salt mine, when I first moved over there, when they brought the salt out, it used to come out wet. It used to be real wet. And then it had a canvas over the top of it. Now, no canvas, no water. People have a lot of health problems there right now. So we have a problem over there where we at, but we still need help, and we need help from everybody. You know, we're here. You know, we're part of Ohio City, and we help you, and we hopefully you help us.
So one thing before you pass the mic, it sounds like there's a lot of infrastructure problems, but from the
Yes.
very beginning, you hinted that, or you said that there were a lot of people that wanted the land
Right.
that you're on. Do you
Absolutely.
fear that they will take the land, and is that a problem that you see, that they're going to take the land and then everybody there is going to have to move out?
Well, we've seen a lot of places disappear, you know, from we've been there. We've lost some areas up on 25th. I'll say, just say we lost some area up on 25th. But we are historical, you know, so that makes a difference, you know. You can do but so much, you know, to the area. Right now, you know, we need a lot of, like you said, infrastructure. We need a lot of help building some of the places, the bricks and some of the things. But, you know, partner up with somebody maybe can help us out, you know. Yeah.
Fantastic. Stephanie, last but not least.
I would agree, and that kind of touches on what I feel is missing, or you know, what we should be dealing with in Ohio City, is these prioritization of just business over human welfare and practical concerns of people crossing streets from fringes and sort of places where neighborhoods change. Specifically, Hingetown is one of those places, and we often will be getting off the Shoreway and seeing children, you know, being kind of like hurriedly crossed under the underpass where the Shoreway is, and it doesn't make sense to me to pump so much money into business and in neighborhood development and forget about people. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me, and it doesn't feel very human. It doesn't feel very kind, and I'm pretty sure that that's a general problem in Cleveland, but Ohio City has a lot of these borders, and a lot of people are cut off from basic necessities and just their walkability. It just does not feel like a good thing to do to people on sort of a planning level.
Okay, so you've all addressed the third question that I was going to ask. So the last question I did want to just pose to all of you. We did hear a lot from Tim about some of the big names of the past. And I wanted, if we were to project 50 or 100 years into the future, who do you think is going to be remembered from our time right now, and what are they going to be remembered for? And if you could come up with 1 to 3 names, that would be great. But the people in Ohio City that are making that big impact.
I mean, I think there's so many people that I think within 50 years, who knows, like, what's working now could be known as like this was not actually helping the neighborhood.
We might ban alcohol again.
Right, yeah, prohibition might start again. So I would say that, like, it's hard to predict. Like, it's nice to think about the future and what what is obviously, what Sam has brought to the neighborhood is super positive right now for this moment here. But unless we address, the larger growing pace of Ohio City and all of its residents, that may not always be a positive in the future. So I don't know. I think hopefully there'll be a lot of names there, and hopefully they will come from more of like a sort of less of the business world and more of like design and kind of the human factor, people who care about other, people's welfare.
Okay.
That's what I would hope.
Brenda?
Well, my point of view, I guess, is I'm really with the Lord. So if He gonna be here, I think we all be okay. You know what I'm saying?
Well, one thing that's kind of sad is how quickly people are forgotten. If I look back, my association with this community, but when I first moved here in 1982, before that I lived in the Clark-Scranton area, but people are quickly forgotten. But I think there's going to be a couple of people that are going to be remembered. And I think one of them is right here. I think Sam McNulty is going to be remembered decades from now as a guy that really was a catalyst to making this, especially the West 25th Street and the Market District, a vibrant community. And certainly that's what I think we all want. We want a safe and vibrant community. And Sam really got that going in a big way, and I think his name will be remembered. But there's another name that also, and that's from a business standpoint as well as an important stakeholder in the community. But there's another name that a lot of people don't even know, who's been in this community since early 70s, I believe. And he's still on West 32nd Street in Ohio City, and his name is Jim Schlecht, who to me is a living saint. We have a living saint in our midst right here in Ohio City who just has helped so many people that have so many problems, that are experiencing homelessness, and he's been able to help a lot of these folks rise out of that have been mired in addiction and homelessness, and get them into housing. And that's all what homeless people want. It's just they want to get back in the game. They want housing. They want a job. They want to be able to take care of their family. And Jim has helped countless individuals achieve that goal. And it's a name that I think a lot of people don't know, and it's a name that they might forget. But I would hope, 50 years from now, people look back and say, yeah, there was a great community activist and an advocate for the least among us, and his name is Jim Schlecht.
Fantastic, thanks. And Sam, last but not least, who do you think is going to be remembered?
Well, Bob, I appreciate the kind words, but I disagree. Everyone's going to remember Andrew Samtoy started Prohibition. I should say restarted it. It's all your fault. No, I tend to think a lot of us think about posterity and how we're going to be remembered, and the good news is we're not going to be there to experience it or worry about it. This sounds a little sardonic, and Andrew, this is probably not the answer you're looking for, but I think ultimately it's about the moment and living in that moment, and hopefully folks are what we're doing in Ohio City, all of us here, up and down the street, into the neighborhood, everywhere. Hopefully we're making life better for the people that live here and work here and play here. So how we're remembered, hopefully we're all remembered. Hopefully everybody in this room is remembered in some fashion as contributing in a positive way to making this a better place. And again, going back to the early ideas here, is it's all about the people. Names come and go, like Barber. It's a great memory. It's a great history. It sounds like he definitely left a legacy that we're now enjoying. So let's hopefully leave a legacy, and regardless of who's remembered, let's just make sure we do that.
Good. So we have a few questions that I think relate to most of the people on this panel. First, what happens to Ohio City when it stops being trendy? They might need real estate now, but that wasn't true 10 years ago and might not be another 20 years from now. So what happens when people start going to Old Brooklyn or Clark Fulton? And see, yes,
That's a curveball. I didn't know that was coming. That's good. I like that. So I actually, believe it or not, I think a lot about this. So like Cleveland has seen entertainment districts, neighborhoods kind of come and go. I grew up, I was born on the west side over by Triscuit, grew up in Cleveland Heights by Coventry, and then been down here for about a dozen years or so. So the good news is Cleveland's going to continue to evolve like any city, like any place on the planet. A good example is real estate. So, Tim, you can tell the story better than anybody, all the different iterations any property has had. So, like, people are like, oh, you guys bought this building and you own it. It's like, well, we actually don't really own this building. We're custodians of it, during our lifetime in this particular iteration, but it could be completely different. It probably will be in 30 years. Like, I'm sure, or even 50. I'm sure the folks that built it didn't foresee what we're doing here happening. This base, kind of an interesting story, where we're sitting right now didn't exist. This building was built, there's a little bit of a crawl space up front there. We actually had to excavate all this to dig down to create a basement. So the original owners thought, well, there's probably no purpose to having a basement, let's not build one. So I guess the point is, we're custodians of this neighborhood, just like we're custodians of the particular houses or buildings we own. And then eventually we're going to pass or shuffle off this mortal coil, and someone else is going to take that building or house and do something completely different, maybe something we haven't even thought of yet. I mean, who knows? Who knows what the future holds?
So are you saying essentially that it's going to keep changing, and it might not be trendy, but it'll be renewed in some way?
I think it's going to go the way it wants to go. People are going to like whatever people value at that moment. Like, what wants to be next to the West Side Market in 2065? It might not be a brew pub. There might be some other form of intoxication that's way more interesting.
And for Bob and Brenda, that question was followed by another question.
Do I really have to close on that note?
What happens to those who have lived here for years and basically are being pushed out for market rate housing? With the anticipation this might not be trendy for that much longer.
Yeah, that's something that deeply concerns me. From people that just currently rent here, that maybe work for a nonprofit, don't make a lot of money, that want to buy and they can't afford to buy here. I had a neighbor over on Whitman who owns that Rust Belt Welding. That you'll see a lot of those bike racks that were created by Rust Belt Welding. When he outgrew the rental property on Whitman, he had to buy in Lakewood because Lakewood was more affordable than Ohio City. But I'm also seeing a loss of our Latino population. And aside from a heavy concentration of African Americans at Riverview and Lakeview, I think we're losing a lot of our African American population. So we're losing our diversity. And right now it's a boom housing market. I think the bubble will eventually burst. Like the market will correct itself, like all markets tend to do. But the lasting people that will be here in Ohio City are the ones that are currently here, the ones that are renovating a house, the ones that live at Lakeview and Riverview. We are the people, and we're going to prevail. But there could be some tough times, and I'm concerned about this becoming unaffordable to a lot of people that have been living here for many decades.
And Brenda, I'm guessing that you think a lot about this as well. So what's your response to that question? What happens?
Well, yes, where we're at, all the area around us is a lot of rent that we could possibly pay. We pay a third of our rent. So if they took the third of our rent and went on market price as of what they're paying now, we couldn't afford to stay in Ohio City. It's what we need there with us is people with training for jobs, skill jobs. They can't afford to do better for their families. Nobody wants to just stay where they are. It's where we live is supposed to be. You stay there, you get on your feet, then you move, someone else move in, And it come with training and the jobs and then building yourself up, Right now, it's scary, It's beautiful, but it's scary. We don't see ourselves being there long. When we really look at the market price the way it is, we go right up there on 25th, 25th Wood in West 28th Street. It's an apartment building right there. One bedroom was run like $800. You go down the street a little bit, one bedroom is $1,600. That's really going up, you know. But I don't knock, you know, things getting better, because things has to change. But we need things to change for us, our infrastructure. You know what I'm saying? Things to look better for us.
So what?
Where we at? You can sit where we at, and we can see everything that goes on. We see the fireworks, we see the stadium. You can get a beautiful picture. You could take a picture and sell that picture for $1 million where we at right now, you know? But what is it good if we're not there?
But if what you fear comes about, where would you go? Is there any?
Well, ain't nowhere else we could go, but we're going back to where the people that moved into the city from. We would be in the suburbs, and the houses where they live. Most of the people from there, they're moving to here, to the city. You know, they can push us out there where they are. I don't want no house that you left about to fall down. You've been in there for 30, 40 years, nobody put no money in it. That's why you're leaving it, because you don't want to be bothered no more. No gas bill, no light bill, none of that, you know. So, no, I don't want to go there, but what choice do I have?
Okay, and Stephanie, the last question seems tailor-made for what your opening statement was. How do you improve connections between neighborhoods, Tremont to Ohio City to Gordon Square to Edgewater, et cetera? And you've been part of that in Hingetown. So how do you go about making that sort of flow between the neighborhoods?
Well, one of the things first is to recognize that there is too much sort of siloed neighborhood. You know, Ohio City has to hold on to this, and Tremont has to hold on to this, and we're not necessarily Cleveland at that point. We're sort of like, I deal with it a lot because I don't really have a brick and mortar establishment. I can really go where I want to go, and that's terrifying to neighborhoods, because if they really want me there to bring crowds or to bring vibrancy, they want to force me into staying somewhere, whether it's good for my business or not. I don't think that's a right approach. I think that's like a sort of siloed approach. It's based on scarcity. It's not based on kind of abundance and bringing some collective prosperity to everybody. And I understand how neighborhood development companies work, and they really have their own focus, and they really have to do what's best for their people. But to have something that unites them a little bit more and understands sort of what is the end goal of development, you know? Are you so focused for the 5 years of tenure that you're at this one neighborhood development company that you can only focus on this one project that is really nothing other than sort of getting something on your resume, rather than doing something that connects it to either the fringes that are surrounding it or other neighborhoods that could really benefit sort of collectively from working together. So I just think this like siloed approach is not really the most effective approach. And like I said, I do understand that people have their focuses, and it's a good thing, but you don't want to have that and not really kind of look at the general zoomed out perspective of the city.
But to answer that question, it sounds like you're going back to what Sam said about connecting and uniting people. That the end goal of development isn't necessarily so much the brick and mortar places, it's getting people into the same spaces and getting them to connect. So
right, but a lot of development is not really focused on people. So that's just a radical shift in, it's just a little bit how business works too. The people that have the money are going to do the development, and if they have a good idea that's going to bring them cash for that moment, it doesn't really have to do with helping people. That idea will still get through, most likely. You know, so it takes a lot of effort for people who are in development to partner with others that can have a perspective, bring them a perspective that might shift their focus to something a little bit greater than just that tiny little moment.
Okay. Well, with that, we're going to end this Living History. If you want updates on other events, please go to Facebook and like Civic Commons, and all you have to do is search for that. Thanks to our guests for all their information. If we could give them a round of applause, all 5 of them. Thanks to Hallie Briner, Gabe Kramer, and Mike Shafarenko for help producing this event. And a special thanks to Sam McNulty and the staff of Market Garden for hosting us tonight. And no prohibition right now.